Welcome to Keiser Voices, the story of success, brought to you by Keiser University Graduate School, here where the academic world meets personal triumph. Join us today as we dive into the captivating tales of success.
Hi, I am Professor Otto Von Feigenblatt. I'm currently serving as Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Observer to the United Nations for the International Youth Organization. I'm also blessed to be a professor and chair at the Latin Division of the Psychology and also the Educational Leadership Department. So today I'm going to talk about leading in a connected world. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the world is more interconnected than ever and how leadership has changed over the decades. So one of the things that I want to talk about is sharing some of my experiences at the UN and how that has helped me understand this topic of leading in an interconnected world. Well, leadership has become more complex. If we look at the literature on leadership, it started as something very hierarchical, very top-down, with lines of command, clearly defined roles, and those lines have blurred a lot. Especially when we think about leadership at the macro level, we realize that problems are not divided into neatly labeled compartments. Problems tend to be holistic, they tend to be multi-layered, and they also require multi-layered and sophisticated solutions. So we come to the topic of leadership. What is it and how has it changed? Well, if the problems are more complex than ever before and they're interconnected, then we also need leaders who can harness basically the power of their teams, who can find the people who can help them solve those problems. And since problems are multi-sectoral, they're multi-layered, and in many cases they're also interdisciplinary, then those teams also need to be diverse. So we talk about diversity and also leaders who can deal with diversity. Especially at the UN, one thing that I've learned is that in some cases, answers come from the most unexpected of places. And the UN also has a very hierarchical nature. They also have a history of that same hierarchical leadership. And one thing that we're trying to do now is to try to break down those borders and to get young people to participate actively, to help us think outside of the box. In my case, my main function is to deal with young people and to help them bridge, to help them connect with more senior leaders. And young people have in some cases, they don't have the same restraints. They don't have the same assumptions that older people have, partly because of their experiences, their training, their profession. So one thing that I have changed about my own behavior as a leader, and one thing that I've noticed that some of my colleagues, my colleagues who are also diplomats at the UN are doing, is that they're trying to change the format of meetings and the way that they communicate with their team members. Rather than using very formal memos or what we call in diplomacy nota verbalis, which is basically this very formal letter that you send to communicate something, instead of that, trying to hold more informal dialogues and discussions. And the interesting thing is that this change towards focus groups, dialogues, informal meetings is not only taking place inside of individual missions, but is also happening in the Security Council. The Security Council, of course, is considered to be one of the most formal and important parts of the UN because they deal with issues of peace and war. They also deal with sanctions, but they also realize that for the Security Council to continue to be pertinent, they need to include a wider range of stakeholders. They need to communicate in ways which more closely resemble the way that normal people, regular people communicate in the street, in their daily lives. So In order to build bridges, one thing that a leader needs to do in the 21st century is to be, number one, more accessible, more open-minded, and also to withhold judgment. One thing that I really criticize about some leaders who basically follow kind of like an outmoded way of management is that there is this time constraint, and they kind of expect to assess all the alternatives immediately. And as much as the UN is criticized for moving very slowly, one thing that it has taught me is that you have to, number one, brainstorm. You have to gather information about each one of the alternatives, and you have to, in some cases, withhold evaluation. Try not to jump to conclusions immediately, because the issues are so complex and it takes a lot of time and resources to gather all the pertinent information, that if you jump to conclusions, you can make huge mistakes. Okay, so jumping to conclusions in a short time without having all the information, without consulting all the right people, is a big mistake. Now, because of changes in technology and because of greater access to information, now we have this flattening of the leadership structure. That doesn't mean that you're gonna basically get rid of formal titles or that you don't need managers. I mean, of course you do, and you also need a clear line of command. But in terms of access to information, the gap between those who lead and those who follow is not as wide as it used to be. You don't need to have any special security clearance to go to Google, and you can have access to an amazing amount of information. You have access to even satellite information now. So even in topics that deal with international security, there is a lot of information out there that can be accessed as long as people want to look for it and know how to look for it. Now, what that means is that the source of authority of leaders in the 21st century is not only about their official title, is not only about the resources that they control, but it's basically on how they can access the right people. It's about how they can lead those human resources in order to achieve their vision and their mission for their organizations. It's about building bridges. It's about avoiding groupthink. And this is where diversity comes in. There is a lot of research on diversity. Many scholars in organizational behavior, for example, they study about how it's important to establish a homogeneous organizational culture, and all of that is true. But diversity can also be a huge advantage. If a leader embraces diversity, then he or she they can avoid the trap of jumping to groupthink. If you have a bunch of people with the same experiences, the same training, in many cases they will jump to the same conclusion simply because they were trained in the same way, they have seen similar examples, they have experienced similar problems, or in the case in which they all have the same training, they were basically trained to follow the same steps to reach the conclusion. But something amazing happens when you have people who disagree, but who disagree with a reason. In other words, people who might come from different backgrounds, they might have different professional experiences, and because of that, they can take the same information, process it, and they can come up with different recommendations. And that is when leadership comes in. Because the job of the leader is basically to take in all of those ideas, that advice, that information, those points of view, and to somehow use it for the group to come up with a solution or to come up with some alternatives to a problem. So this requires facilitation skills. It requires mediation skills. So basically, the leader becomes an expert in soft skills. The leader is someone who could be, I would call the leader almost like a head cheerleader, because basically they're trying to harness the leadership, the individual leadership of their team members in order to achieve a common goal. And that requires humility, it requires self-understanding, and it also requires, of course, a lot of emotional intelligence. You need facilitation skills. And you need to accept one important thing, which is that in many cases, your team members are going to know a lot more than you do. And this is something, again, that is different about leadership today compared to the way it was, let's say, 30 or 40 years ago, in which leaders, they were the ones who knew, they were the ones who were supposed to know at least, and it was very top down. It was like, I know how you have to do things, and I'll tell you how to do them, and I'll let you know if you're doing it the correct way. But now it's not so much about that. It's about, I know how to connect this source of knowledge with this other source of knowledge, and to create that bridge so that we can all achieve our common goal, or so that we can all have a dialogue as to what that goal is. Because in many cases, the goal will not be set at the top leadership levels. That's another change that has happened. So yes, increased diversity is definitely a big change at the international level. Now, this is something that you also see at the classroom level, because leadership is not only at the macro level, it doesn't only happen at the international level, but you even see it when you're facilitating a class. You see that you have, in many cases, a very diverse student population. There is a digital gap for some students, especially older students compared to younger students. They have different perspectives as to how the class is supposed to function. For example, younger students expect a lot more participation. They expect that they're going to have some say in terms of how the class is run, in terms of the activities that will take place, especially in a live class. Whereas older students, they might have a more one-sided idea of what a class is supposed to look like. They want to be recipients of information and knowledge, and they expect to be led in a particular direction. So one of the challenges of being a teacher today in the 21st century is that you also have to be a leader who builds bridges. You have to take the perspectives of young people into consideration, which means in some cases having a more dynamic class, understanding that in some cases they do want direct answers and they want them now, which means that they want a very direct style of teaching, that provides information and provides answers. While at the same time, you might have some older students with considerable experience who want a different style that basically, provides more guidance and that does not require as much participation from them. And that is the challenge. That is the challenge, that the same way as we recognize that leadership is changing at the macro level, that international problems require more dynamic and multi-layered solutions, we need to get the next generation of leaders prepared for this new world, for this world that requires a different type of leadership or influence. And one thing that this conversation reminds me of is the meaning of leadership and what is behind it. There is a lot of research trying to explain the difference between leadership and management. And usually it comes down to how leaders tend to be more creative, and they do a lot more than just the day-to-day operations, of course, of an office or an organization. The leadership includes maybe creating a vision and a mission and inspiring people to follow and help implement that mission and vision. But recently I talked to a well-known British scholar. Her name is Professor Linda Evans. And after more than 3 decades of research on this issue of leadership, she told me something that really caught me off guard, which is that she doesn't like the term leadership, because leadership boils down to a single word, which is influence. And that was a very interesting idea. I mean, I had to think about it very carefully because she has done a lot of research on this for 3 decades, a lot of empirical research. And I asked her, can you explain a little bit more? What do you mean that leadership is not the correct word to describe this phenomenon in the 21st century? She says basically it's about influence. It's about convincing and getting other people to do things that they wouldn't do otherwise. And she's right. I mean, if you think about it, nowadays, more than ever, leadership is about convincing people to help you achieve certain goals. It is more consensual than it ever has. If we think about generational differences, and we talk about Gen Z, for example, they expect to have some say in the way they do their jobs. But not only that, they want to feel connected to the mission and the vision of the organization. So their values have to be aligned with the values of the organizations for which they work. And this is a big change if we compare, for example, Gen Z to baby boomers, where they basically had this idea that they would align their own lives to the goals of the big corporation or the big organization, or in some cases they just viewed a job as a job. Basically, they divided their own personal ideas, their own values, their own mores, like they say in anthropology, from their jobs in their companies. But in the case of young people nowadays, they expect those things to be well aligned. They expect that they will share some of the same values as the organizations they support. And they also feel that if those values are not well aligned, they also have that freedom of movement. So leadership is definitely more situational today than it was before. There is a lot of movement in terms of the labor market. It's accepted for people in many cases to move from one job to another job, from one organization to another organization, and even from one sector to another sector. And part of the reason why this happens is because the relationship between a person and their organization has changed. People don't view a job as the end in and of itself. They view the job as simply a part of their lives. And in some cases, they view it as a way for them to achieve their goals, but their goals not only for their own individual lives in terms of family, of earning, salary, healthcare, but they also view it as a way for them to facilitate their goals for society at large. They view it as the way in which they interrelate with the rest of society. It brings us back to the initial topic of building bridges. So, my recommendation for a leader in the 21st century, a leader in this interconnected world, is that you have to learn how to build those bridges. And there is no universal bridge, because depending on who you're trying to connect to, that bridge is going to look different. That bridge is going to be either wider, it's going to be built of concrete, or it might be a very flexible bridge. And that's part of it. So build bridging is going to be situational. It requires understanding how that person can fit in the organization and how those persons' individual goals can also align with your goals as a leader and the goals of your organization. Now, obviously, this is in many ways a lot more complex than it was in a military-style organization, for example, which was the ideal for decades, even in the private sector. But at the same time, it also provides many opportunities. It provides the opportunity of not restricting those team members to only contribute in a very limited way in what I would call a cookie cutter approach. Instead of that, you're basically, in a way, shaping the way in which they can fit into the organization based on their personal characteristics, which are going to be unique. And that unleashes a huge potential for creativity. It also allows organizations to be truly learning entities. If we think about systems theory, an organization depends on its parts, and obviously the most important part of any organization is the people. And as a leader, it is your job to be the mediator between the entire organization, you could say. Think about an organism and those individual parts. So depending on you, that individual will be a great asset to the organization, or they could simply become a liability. Or in many cases, something that could also happen is that if you don't build that bridge at the right time, someone else will. And then you're going to lose that talent, and that will affect, at the macro level in the organization, your ability to achieve your goals, your ability to support the mission and the vision of your organization. So flexibility, adaptability, and a lot, of course, of understanding and adapting to differences. Those are some of the traits and the requirements of a leader in this new age of building bridges. Universities are uniquely positioned to be leaders in many ways. The universities, they are basically bridges between two important stages of life. Young people or even older people, they usually enter the university thinking that the university is basically like a tunnel or a bridge to something new. That something new can be a new stage in their careers, it can be a new stage in their lives. But the idea is for universities to empower them to connect to that next stage in their lives or their careers. So universities not only create knowledge, but they also serve as the highways to the goals of many people who study in them. As a result of that, universities have a responsibility to not only be anchored in the past, because yes, they are repositories of knowledge, but also to be forward-looking. So universities, they have to help society move forward. They have to lead society with creative solutions, and they also have to lead society by creating leaders. And how do universities do this? Well, universities do this by teaching them soft skills. Universities do this by teaching them how to deal with uncertainty and how to be more tolerant of diversity. Universities do this by preparing them to be problem solvers. So as you can see, universities are leaders in their own right. Universities have the potential to be catalysts for change. Universities have the potential to create social mobility. And they do this by training people to be leaders. And this leadership has to be a new type of leadership. It has to be a leadership that is flexible, that is adaptable, and that basically accepts the fact that knowledge is changing, that situations will always be changing, and that the same way as world leaders need to be flexible and they need to be open-minded, our students, our graduates, they also need to be ready to accept the fact that we live in an uncertain world, and that part of living in an uncertain world means that we have to be open to change and that we have to be part of that change. And that is basically leadership in the 21st century. Well, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be in this podcast. I invite all of you to watch future episodes of the podcast Keiser Voices, the story of success. Thank you.
Thank you for journeying with us today on Keiser Voices, the story of success. As we close this chapter, remember, every story has its next page.